Well, if you'll find your way, don't be surprised, over to 2 Samuel. Of course, we've been in this series of messages about becoming a person after God's own heart, as we've looked at David as the example of that. And so I'm going to be preaching this morning on this subject, right ways to relate to people who have either hurt us or blessed us. Let me ask you, is our screen working this morning? Just trying to find out. All right. So that's another thing here. I knew that we were working on, we had a little glitch on. So, hey, we've been preaching and doing this a long time before we had screens. But I do have we have a bulletin here. And so that's what we're going to be dealing with. The right way to relate to people who've either hurt us or blessed us. Now, in the course of your life, I care not probably how long you've lived. Maybe if you haven't been around too long, you don't know what I'm talking about. But just about all of us, just by the very virtue of living life, we've had those experiences already when we've experienced abuse or hurts at the hands of other people. And though we may not have noticed it and focused on it and appreciated it to the degree that we should, we've also experienced more than likely many blessings at the hands of other people. So we've experienced one or the other, or in fact we have experienced both. You may be experiencing both now. It may have been a while but since you experienced both. But regardless here, you all are going to have to deal with that in the future, and you're going to know that you've experienced it in the past. So we're going to talk about this morning right ways to relate to people who've either hurt us or blessed us. First thing we're going to look at here, you know, we've been talking about David and looking in his life. First of all, we learned that we are to forgive those who hurt us. We are to forgive those who hurt us. Now, you know, David, what's been taking place? Absalom has revolted, has rebelled, has been basically kind of taking over the kingdom. David's kind of been on the run. And so now you're at the place where David is being restored to the kingdom as the king. And so as David gets back to Jerusalem, he encounters a guy by the name of Shimei. Now, you remember here, and maybe you don't remember, so I'm going to tell you this story. Back when David was being forced out of Jerusalem by Absalom, Shimei had stood on a hill and had thrown curses at David, cussed him out, the way we would say it today. And also he'd been throwing rocks at David and his men. And you remember what had happened was, the men, they said, man, we need to cut, what guy said, just cut his head off. I mean, we don't have to put up with this stuff. And so that's what's going to be said later here. But you see, David, what did he do? David kept his men from striking Shimei down, saying 2 Samuel 16, verses 11 and 12. I'm talking about at this point in time, he's referring back to when he had been running away because Absalom was coming into power. He said, let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him. I mean, the Lord might be using this to humble me. Perhaps, verse 12, the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of his cursing this day. Now, you see, as David was returning to Jerusalem, this same Shimei who had acted that way before when David was having to leave, now David's coming back as the king. This same Shimei shows up again, but this time, guess what? He's acting a little different because David's coming back to be the king now, and he's acting real contrite. Oh, my, he's coming back. He's going to be the king now. And so what did Shimei do? He confessed his sin. He pled for mercy from the king, and as a sign of support, Shimei had brought with him 1,000 Benjamites to help David be restored to the throne. And David's men, I started to talk about this a moment ago, David's men were ready to execute Shimei on the spot because, you see, by cursing the king, Shimei had committed a treasonous act, and David would have been, as it were, within his just rights of condemning him. Instead, what David did is he viewed this as an opportunity to extend forgiveness. Now, David undoubtedly extended forgiveness in this instance for some very practical reasons. You see, David needed Shimei and his men. He's coming back, and he could ill afford not to take advantage of these 1,000 men that would be able to help. He also needed, at this point in time, he could be thinking about it politically, he needed to be sending a clear message that he was not going to demand payback from everybody that ever done him wrong. He wasn't going to exact retribution on those who'd chosen to stand with Absalom in the past. And what better way to send that message to everybody that all's forgiven than in this particular instance to go ahead and extend forgiveness to Shimei. However, I think there may have been maybe just a little bit more going on in this act of clemency that David was extending toward Shimei. You see, I believe David really also extended forgiveness to Shimei for personal reasons. David never forgot that he too was once the man who had pled for mercy before the Lord, and that he too had transgressed God's law, and therefore he too was worthy to die. And God had extended love and forgiveness to David instead of just giving to him justice. And I think that David knew that he needed to extend that same mercy toward other people. I believe that David understood that those who have experienced forgiveness should be those who are most eager to extend that same kind of forgiveness to other people. But I wouldn't be really totally being on the level with everything that there is to know about what's going on with David if I didn't also include in here some other things we know about. And that is, I want to tell you there's more said about what's going on in this situation over in 1 Kings chapter 2, and I'll just kind of tell you the story. It's about David's dealings with Shimei, and what's going on there can be a little troubling and a little bit confusing to us. You see, you're at this later stage of David's life, and David is now dying. And David was given at this point in time some final instructions to the new king, who of course we know to be his son Solomon. And in these instructions, what he did was essentially to assign the death warrant for two people. First of all, he signed the death warrant for Joab. We're not going into all the detail of it, but you see, he is signing the death warrant for Joab because Joab, in spite of being David's general, there were some things that Joab had done to undermine David's authority, besides the fact that Joab had murdered several innocent men, but also what David was giving these instructions to Solomon was he essentially signed the death warrant for Shimei, whom we're talking about right here. And basically, here's what David told Solomon. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here. He said, you know, I promised that I would not kill Shimei, but Solomon, you are not me. I made the promise. And so Solomon, we know the way that played out, is that Solomon told Shimei, Shimei, you've got to stay in Jerusalem. And that if you fail to stay in Jerusalem, you're going to be killed. I want you to think of this like, I don't know if we have any, probably none of us here would have this personal experience, of course, but you see the movies and where, for instance, you might have somebody have an ankle bracelet on and they'd be confined to a particular area as they're maybe, and so that if they go out, they're not to go past this place, that is while they're on parole. So 3 years later, when Shimei did what Solomon said you're not to do, that is to leave Jerusalem, what happened to Shimei? Shimei was executed. So we need to ask the question, or I think it's a fair question. Did David truly forgive Shimei, or when he acted the way he did towards Shimei, was he merely exercising political expediency that governed the day? Did David forgive the personal offense against him, but believe that Shimei must still be held responsible for the civil offense? That is, you know, here's a guy, you have betrayed, not just maybe taking it personally, but you have betrayed the king. That's a treasonous act. Did David believe that Shimei would be a threat to Solomon, his son, as then Solomon had come upon the throne? Well, I'm asking these questions. We don't really absolutely know the answer to those questions, but what we do know is this. True forgiveness means this. It means letting go of the hurt and leaving the judgment and leaving the wrath and leaving, if there needs to be any payback, the vengeance, leaving it to God. Let go of it and let God take care of it. And so that's the first thing we want to talk about. The second thing I want us to look at here, we're talking about the right ways to relate to those who have hurt us or have been a blessing to us. And so we've seen that first way is to, when we've been hurt, is to extend forgiveness toward that person who's hurt us. Here's the second thing. Number 2, be willing to listen to the explanation of a person who has hurt you. Now, we want to look at 2 people here that we've met before as we've been going through these narratives, looking at the life of David and other people involved in his life. That is, we're going to look here again at people we looked at before, Ziba and Mephibosheth. Now, you remember Mephibosheth was the crippled son of David's great friend Jonathan. And David, you remember, had promised that he was going to take care of Mephibosheth for the rest of his life. And you remember that was Ziba that had introduced David to Mephibosheth, and that Ziba had been given the job of managing the estate, that is all this land, managing the estate that had been given by David to Mephibosheth. Now, look back at what had been taking place. David had been forced out of Jerusalem when Absalom was coming to take over as the king. And when David was forced out of Jerusalem, Ziba had joined forces with David. But Mephibosheth did not come along with Ziba. And Ziba, and David's asking, he says, well, where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba says, well, I'll tell you where he is. He said he stayed behind. He didn't really want to come because he was hoping to see the kingdom return to his father's family. Now, how do you suppose that would make David feel upon hearing that? David was understandably hurt at what he had heard, and he was angered that the kindness that he'd been showing to Mephibosheth had been spurned. And so David, hearing what he'd heard and taking it on face value that what Ziba had told him was true, David told Ziba, Ziba, you're going to have all the land. It's going to be yours, all the land that previously I'd given over to Mephibosheth. And Ziba and his sons fought valiantly for David. Now, as David's returning home, guess what? The crippled Mephibosheth, he shows up. You're going to see, well, you know what? There's a little bit more to this story than what Ziba had been telling. And so Mephibosheth came out to meet David as David's returning, and this is what he had told to David. Look at 2 Samuel 19, verse 24. He, that is Mephibosheth, had neither cared for his feet. Remember, he was crippled, had been crippled when he had been dropped, when the nurse was running away with him, when it looked like he would be killed if he had been caught because he was still a descendant of Saul. And so he, Mephibosheth, had neither cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came home in peace. In other words, when you read that passage of Scripture, what it seems to imply, what it seems to be saying very clearly, it appears that Mephibosheth had really been grieving ever since David had been forced to depart, that is, from being in Jerusalem, from remaining there as king, and that in fact of the matter, Mephibosheth, contrary to what Ziba had said, Mephibosheth is the way he's appearing here, it very much appears like he had been someone who had not been celebrating the fact that David was being forced to leave and being forced off the throne. He was one who had been grieving all this. And so you see, Mephibosheth's story is very much different than the story that Ziba had told David. And Mephibosheth said that he wanted to come with David, but Ziba had left him behind. And so David what could David have done? David could have immediately dismissed Mephibosheth, but instead, when Mephibosheth showed up on the scene, David took the time to grant him a hearing. David took the time to listen to what it was Mephibosheth had to say, and so there's a lesson for you and me here. Rather than draw conclusions without all the information, it's always, always, always a good idea to let somebody else explain. And you see, for David, rather than just to immediately strike out at Mephibosheth or to cast Mephibosheth aside, what did David do? David took the time to listen to what Mephibosheth had to say, and David learned, at least from what Mephibosheth is saying here, David learned that Mephibosheth really had not betrayed him the way Ziba said that he had. And so there's a lesson for you and me. Many of the conflicts that we have in life, mark this down, many of the conflicts and the problems that we have with other people in life are the result of misunderstanding. If you heard me say that, say amen. Many of the conflicts that we have in life are the result of misunderstanding rather than any real offense. And if we would listen, much of the conflict would disappear. I think of how many problems there are between husbands and wives, or between parents and children, or people on the job, or just doing life, running into people. How much of that is so unnecessary? How much of that could be worked out if we would just listen to what the other person had to say? And so David sought to make things right. And so David declared, how's he going to deal with this situation? I mean, Mephibosheth says this, Ziba says this. He's not there to have heard what happened. So what David did was he declared that Mephibosheth and Ziba would divide the land. You see, it could be that David was not sure really who is it who's telling the truth. It could be that he felt that not only did he owe Mephibosheth, because after all he had promised to Jonathan that he's going to take care of him, but also that he owed Ziba for his faithful service. And so in this case, David sought to be gracious to both of these men. It could be, we don't know, it could be that this was really some kind of test to see if Mephibosheth will really continue to remain loyal even if he ends up losing some of his land. No matter what the reason, reconciliation came about because why? Because David took time to listen. I want to ask you right now, who is that person in your life that maybe you've really had a problem with, maybe you're really estranged from them, and maybe that person's tried to come up to you and share with you there might be some more things going on, but you have just said, I've had it with them, I won't listen to them, and it could be that God's trying to give you a word to say, you know what, you need to go and listen to what the other person has to say, and maybe, just maybe, that relationship could be restored. Now, here's the third thing here. We're talking about the right ways to relate to those who have hurt us and who've been a blessing to us. We've been talking thus far about those who have hurt us, but let's think in terms, thirdly, here about those who've been a blessing to us. So, number 3, be sure to express gratitude to those who have come through for you during your hard times. Now, as you get a few chapters into this narrative, we're introduced to a guy by the name of Barzillai. Barzillai. Now, as David was leaving Jerusalem on the run, remember, Absalom has come in. He'd been declared, he made that announcement over in Hebron. And wow, it's just really looking bad. And so David had been on the run because his son Absalom's taken over the throne, and it's very, very dangerous. And so back during that time, as David was leaving Jerusalem on the run, 2 Samuel 17, verses 28 and 29 tells us what Barzillai had done for David and his men. Let's look at those verses. Barzillai brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd, for David and for the people who were with him to eat. David brought all that for the people to eat, David and his men. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. You know what that'd be like today? That would be like someone showing up with a semi-truck full of supplies for a bunch of refugees. That's exactly what it was like. That's what Barzillai was doing for David and his men while they're on the run. When times are hard, you've all heard the saying, it's absolutely true. When times are hard, you learn who your true friends are. And so when David was still considered to be an outcast, Barzillai was the man of the hour. Barzillai was there to provide for his basic needs. And even though, I think about when you go to the grocery store and they got the National Enquirer or whatever, you got all that stuff out there on that's plastered faces on the news, there's you're trying to check out, or you get your newspaper and whatever's going on in the news, whatever is big. Now, I'd think of it like if they had newspapers during the day, I would think of it like this. It's like David's face is splashed unflatteringly across all the tabloids of the day. Look at this terrible guy, David. And it's during that kind of time that Barzillai remained loyal to the king. And David was encouraged, and David was strengthened by his friend, and David would never forget the act of kindness that Barzillai had shown him during his great time of need. You know what I suspect today? I suspect there's not a one of us who's under the sound of my voice this morning who does not have a Barzillai in your life. You think about it for a moment. It may be a mother that worked all night to help you finish a project that absolutely had to be turned in. I mean, maybe it was something you were working on in school, or, something just had to be done, and you know who came through? Mama came through. Or it may have been a dad who maybe hardly anybody else knows about it, or maybe a lot of people do know about it, but this father's the one who came to get you in the middle of the night when you were out there in a place where you didn't need to be. But Dad was there for you. Maybe it was a friend who stood by you when everybody else was attacking you like hungry wolves. That's the kind of thing, if you got any integrity at all, that's going to be something that you ought to really appreciate, that here you are, it seems like everybody's against you, and that's the person who's standing up for you during your time of need. It may be a teacher, it may be a coach, it may be an employer, somebody who believed in you when you did not believe in yourself. It may be somebody who maybe you hadn't even thought about them, but they just, as it were, came out of nowhere to stand by your side during your time of loss or during your time of illness. And I want to tell you something. We owe these people our gratitude. And they hold a special place in our hearts. And so what did that's what Barzillai was to David. And so what David did was to invite Barzillai to return with him as David's going back to go back and take over the kingdom as being the king. And he says, Barzillai, you come on back with me. And you know what, Barzillai, you're going to do, what I'm going to do for you? I want you to be able to enjoy all the good things of life in the executive mansion. You come on with me. And here's what Barzillai said. I'm going to basically paraphrase it for you here. He said, David, I appreciate your kindness, but you know what? My taste buds are shot. And I tell you what, my hearing's about gone. And I tell you what, David, I go back there to live with you and all of the riches and the wealth that you're saying you're going to provide for me. And, I know that if I go back with you, I'm just going to kind of be more of a burden to you than I will be an aid to you. And the truth is, David, I will just as soon be the one who's able to sit in my recliner, sit in my bed, and die in my own home. And Barzillai suggested to David, he said, David, if you really feel it's so necessary to be so gracious, why not just bestow the blessing upon my son, Kimham. And so we know that David did bless Kimham. And what I say to all of us today, oh, to have the spirit of Barzillai. I'm going to tell you, we could afford to have in our lives a whole lot of people who had the spirit of Barzillai. The man was not after riches and blessing. He only wanted to serve and honor the king. You see, for Barzillai, it was not about him. It was about the king. And we see this same kind of attitude in the life of Jesus. As you and I go through life, there's not a one of us who's not going to experience blessings and abuses from others as we go through this life. The issue that's been raised for us this morning is this: what will you do in response to those kinds of actions? You know what sinful human nature does? Sinful human nature tends to spotlight the offenses and overlook the blessings. We end up being those who are so much more likely to criticize than we are to applaud. And the main thing that we learn from these tests that these guys went through in their lives is that we have it backwards. We should be overlooking offenses and celebrating blessings. Let me tell you something. It is right and proper to honor spouses, fathers, mothers, grandparents, veterans, and a host of others. It's a good thing to celebrate birthdays. We need to do more of this. And instead of focusing on what we don't have, we should be those who rejoice in that which we've been given. We do much more good when we encourage than when we criticize. You see, when we encourage, what we do, we spur one another on. When we strike back, we drag people down and we leave them wounded along the road of life. Let me just say something that needs to be said. Some wounds are deep. They're very hurtful. Things that have been done. Grace, just like I'm talking about in this sermon, there's a lot of stuff like here, a whole lot easier to preach on than it is to practice. I have to live life just like you do. Grace, forgiveness, and reconciliation are easy to talk about, but they're much harder to extend. And let me say something else. Grace and forgiveness are not about ignoring a wrong that is done. Rather, it's about putting that injustice into the hands of Jesus. And getting past the hurt involves seeing ourselves clearly as those who have committed great offenses ourselves, and as we ourselves who have received a great mercy. And as we take time to listen to other people, we will discover that many of the hurts that we have experienced at the hands of others are really just a cry of pain from the one who is hurting. So if you're here this morning as somebody who's just kind of licking your wounds, or maybe you might even be the person that you're in a position where you can pay back. You can, as it were, exact retribution on the person or the persons who caused those wounds. Then I want to challenge you with these statements here. First of all, are you listening? Forgiveness is at its core an issue of trust and obedience. I'm going to say it again. If you heard me say that, say amen. Forgiveness is at its core an issue of trust and obedience. And here's the issue. Will you act in the way that God has told you to act? He said, forgive. Will you obey the Lord even in this area? Will you trust Him even with your wounds? Here's the second statement. The Lord does not ask us to pay Him back. That's impossible. But He does ask us to do this. He does ask us to pay it forward. He has commissioned us, you and me, to be dispensers of grace in a world that's intent on getting even. And one more thing here. Give thanks to those who've been a blessing to your life by helping you to carry the load. And let them know how greatly they have been used by God to enrich your life. And let me tell you something. There really is a very good chance that they really do not realize the impact that they've had on your life. And when you take the time to spotlight the strengths and the blessings of others, you know what you're doing? You are becoming a grace dispenser. And this sermon series has been about becoming a person after God's own heart. You see, in that time, what are you doing? You take the step toward living with the heart of God. I'm going to tell you, we can do a lot of stuff in our doing church. We can do a lot of stuff in our, what we call living out our Christianity. But I'm going to tell you, what we're talking about right here, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where it's going to really show that there's a difference in our lives. And this is where we're going to really be blessed.